This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This show was recorded on June 19th, 2018, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, is Adam Gardner.
What's up, cuboids?
And special guest, Jim Davies.
How's the rain on the rhubarb?
It's great, Jim. Thanks for asking. We have a great show for you today. I'm going to talk to you about used clothing donation and what you should do with it. But first, Jim is going to explore the world of memory palaces.
Human memory is really amazing, and we can remember a lot of things. And there is thought to be no real limit to the number of things that we can remember. But I think that we all know that there are some serious limitations to it. One of the things that's really hard for people to do is to remember ordered lists of things. We're not really good at that. We're really good at remembering a face or this or that, but remembering long digits of numbers or a bunch of items in a list is actually pretty hard. There have been a lot of ways invented to help with this kind of thing, and these generally go under the name of a mnemonic, and that's sort of a memory device. And all that means is that it's using your imagination and some kind of structure to help you remember things. What's interesting is that you're actually adding things to your memory, so you have to remember more, but it ironically makes it easier to remember all of it.
Does that name come from the movie Johnny Mnemonic?
It does, actually. That's the first use, is the movie, and that inspired the book that was written earlier.
Keanu Reeves is a visionary. First The Matrix, now that. One
of the most famous ways to remember lists of things is something called a memory palace. And this is attributed to somebody in ancient Greece, but I don't think anyone knows for sure exactly where it came from. But what it involves is a walkthrough in your imagination of a physical geography that you know really well, usually a house. That's why it's called a palace, right? Because it's usually some interior that you're very familiar with. So it's often your childhood home or a friend's house or your parents' house or something like that. And the idea is that you go through your memory palace in some structured way. You go through it the same way every time, and you have a bunch of places that you've identified as locations. So let me just give an example using one from my own. This is the house I remember growing up in. So the first location in my memory palace is the turntable where I would play records. So that's the first location. And the second location is the top of my desk. And then I walk over to the window and I look out the window and there's a tree outside, and sitting under the tree, that's the third location. So if I wanted to remember three things in order, I could place things at those locations that are easy to remember. When I say things, I mean images, right? So I might, let's say I got to go to the store, I got to buy bananas, eggs, and milk. Okay, so I might imagine a banana on the turntable, and I imagine it as vividly as I can. In fact, I might imagine like 100 bananas spinning around on the turntable, flying off, splattering. And then on the desk, I put eggs in various stages of cracking, and a chicken is coming out of one of them. And then under the tree outside, I picture a cow running around leaking milk out of its udders. Okay, so
Nice.
So this is, now it's very easy for me. I just go back to the turntable, and what's there? Bananas. And then they're all over the turntable. And then there are eggs and chickens all over the desk. In this particular memory palace of my childhood home, I have 70 locations. That's 70 locations.
Wow.
So I can, if I practice it, I can put 70 different images there and pretty much remember them. And the reason that we're good at this is because human beings are very good at remembering where we put stuff. So it's actually quite amazing that you can remember where you parked your car, where you placed your keys. Once in a while you forget, but it's actually kind of remarkable that you can remember the spatial location of so many things, so many little objects in your life.
Which I assume has some relation to our evolutionary heritage as opposed to more abstract things we might try to remember nowadays.
Yes, that's right. So remembering where things are in our environment was, probably very useful for humans, and, squirrels can do it really, really well.
Yeah. They're nuts about it.
They're nuts about it. Yeah, they could probably make a killer forest palace or something.
Oh, cool.
So that's the basics of how memory palaces work.
That's a great overview. For those who watch Sherlock, they use the term mind palace there, but that might be the other popular exposure people might have had. Is there evidence to back this up? Do people use this? Is there research?
Yes, there hasn't been a lot of study on it, but a very famous scientist named Gordon Bower did a study in the 70s and found that using this method, people could remember, 2 to 7 times more things. So there is some evidence that it works. In fact, a lot of mentalists, people who do magic tricks that involve the mind, memory tricks, they just use memory palaces. That's all they're doing. And if you read a really interesting book called Moonwalking with Einstein, it's all about memory competitions in which they try to memorize 7 decks of cards shuffled, the order. And what they do is it's called Moonwalking with Einstein because they have certain images associated with the number 6 and the spade and the whatever, and then they just create an image of moonwalking with Einstein in San Diego, and they can remember 3 different cards with that one image or something like that.
Do you think people also who are in those remembering pi competitions might use something?
Oh yes, people who remember digits of pi also use memory palaces. I read in Moonwalking with Einstein there was somebody who was trying to win, and as he was filling his memory palace with the numbers of pi, someone beat the record, and he thought it was so hopeless that he had to spend hours and hours clearing out his memory palace. Oh. So you have to go through and clear, imagine the thing being removed from it. Otherwise, you'll get interference the next time you try to use it for something.
Be careful what you do at home, kids, because you might clutter up your brain with digits of pi that you no longer want.
Yeah, and I want to stress that it's easier to remember things, but it's not effortless because you have to take time to rehearse these memory palaces.
Yeah.
But the good thing is that it's something you can do while you're waiting in line at the grocery store, while you're otherwise bored, or trying to go to sleep. Every night I try to review one of my 10 memory palaces according to the day of the week.
Jim is so prolific and effective. If you're waiting in line at the grocery store, you should probably be listening to our podcast. But I could understand if you're in bed trying to fall asleep.
Oh, they've already listened to all the episodes, but after that.
So you cycle through different memory palaces on different days of the week. Is it because it's worse to use the same one 2 days in a row or something like that? Is there some logic there?
So the memory palace example I just gave you is what I call my temporary memory palace. And that's just for remembering things for a very short amount of time until I can basically write them down. Mm-hmm. I usually use it when I'm driving or biking. So if I'm biking, especially in the winter, I don't want to stop the bike and get out my pad and write it down in the middle of traffic. But I might remember 4 or 5 things I have to do on my bike ride. I have to call the dog groomer. I have to reschedule the dentist. I need to put this on the shopping list. And I'll just populate my memory palace with various images. And then as soon as I get to work, I jot them all down and then clear out the memory palace. But I have about 10 memory palaces that I'm working on right now. Mm-hmm. And some of them are permanent. You might say my permanent collection, meaning that the objects in them never change. Yeah. So my parents live on an island some of the part of the year, and I have one memory palace for the island, and that is purely dedicated to the lyrics of the album Graceland. So I can sing the entire album Graceland, and that's something else I do when I'm just have nothing else to do. I can just sing the whole album to myself in my head or out loud. And, the lyrics are somewhat complicated and poetic, so I have I have images for all those things. I'll give you an example. So the second song on the album is called Graceland, and the first lyric is, "The Mississippi Delta was shining like a national guitar." So it's on that part of the memory palace is on a boat, parked at a dock, and in the back of the boat is the first location. And I imagine a guitar, but the neck of the guitar is actually a river. So that reminds me of the Mississippi Delta was shining like a national guitar. I am following the river down the highway through the cradle of the Civil War, and I imagine a little baby soldier, Civil War soldier, in a cradle on the floor of the boat. And so by going through all these different locations in order, I reach the next line, and I remember what the songs are. So when I say I rehearse a different memory palace every night, Monday night is The Island and the Graceland album. And I only have one every night of the week, so I try to get through them and rehearse all of them.
Okay. To those listeners who are pretty skeptical, as you should be of almost everything, this does fit with general psychological research, as Jim indicated, that if you're trying to remember anything, just trying to do rote memorization is not nearly as effective as elaborative encoding. If you can create some sort of emotional attachment, or as Jim said, some sort of visual imagery associated with something to have it be more meaningful to you, you're far more likely to remember it. If you have a good enough imagination or visual memory, you can then navigate a landscape like your home, as you said, or some sort of physical location. Now, for people who have poor imagination, I assume this would not work as well?
I don't know about that. I think that imagery might help, but I think everyone has a pretty reasonable spatial conceptual imagination. In other words, even people who have very low mental imagery know where things are in their house. Yeah. Even blind people know where things are in their house. So your knowledge of where things are might actually get you pretty far. There haven't been studies on it. It'd be great if somebody did. But abstract things are certainly harder to remember because you have to concretize them into some kind of concrete thing. Just like if you were painting the idea of justice. So we were just talking about the movie The Justice League, right? So if I wanted to remember something about justice, I want to read John Rawls' Theory of Justice. If I want to put that on my turntable, it's harder than bananas, right? So I might imagine the Justice Scales, or I might imagine the Justice League, and admittedly, sometimes later I'll go back to my memory palace and I'll see, Superman and Aquaman, and I'll be like, what was I trying to, what was I trying to say with that?
Or the very elaborate, weird, sort of semicircular oval of Kurt Von Houten trying to describe dignity in Pictionary on the Simpsons.
Right, yes, that might be challenging,
dignity,
right?
Come on, it's obvious.
And there was a study showing that you can't have more than one thing in a location unless they're integrated, right? If I wanted to remember, I have to tell my wife that Cynthia said this nice thing, I might imagine my wife hugging Cynthia. And that's a unified image, right? If I just imagine Cynthia and my wife with no connection between them, that's two things I have to remember.
Yeah.
As opposed to the hug, which is one conceptual chunk, right? So the moonwalking with Einstein's a great example, right? Because Einstein and moonwalking, it's not just I'm remembering moonwalking and I'm remembering Einstein. Yes. But Einstein moonwalking is a very distinct unified image. I even use a toy castle, the Fisher-Price toy castle, as the memory palace for all my memory palaces. Oh, nice. So because I know this toy so well, I can actually shrink myself down in my imagination and walk through that as though it were a house. And that's how I know what's on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I just walk through, and that's where I keep all my memory palaces. Yeah.
So do you have any, practical tips you could give some of our listeners if they wanted to try this, or an example they might be able to use?
Sure. I'll talk about a couple palaces I have, and I'll describe one that I've been working on lately about things to ask people, right? So when you're at a party or you meet somebody and you have an awkward moment of silence, it's a little hard to get the conversation going. In our culture, you say, what do you do? And they say they work for the government, and then the conversation dies, right? So I came up with this list of questions that are, hopefully not too probing, but, open-ended. So the first one is, how do you treat yourself? And what I mean by that is, if you want to give yourself a treat, if you want to reward yourself in some specific way, what do you do? And I imagine that. So I have my wife's parents' house is the memory palace I use for questions to ask people. So on the front lawn is a huge stack of candies, Kit Kats, and all this stuff, and that reminds me of treats. So how do you treat yourself, right? Yeah. And then I walk up to the front stoop, and there's the Challenger exploding. The Space Shuttle Challenger is taking off from the stoop and exploding, and that reminds me of the question, so what challenges have you been facing in your life lately? Which is open-ended enough that people don't have to talk about super private stuff, but they might say, well, at work I've been dealing with this. And then inside are her parents holding hands, and I can ask, so how are you similar to your romantic partner, and how are you different? Which is something, people like to talk about themselves, right? And then, I've got about 5 more questions like that. So that's like something that I think that everybody could use something like that.
To share a personal anecdote, because that's what this episode's about, anecdotes, that Jim went through this with me when we met a few weeks ago, and I managed to retain 60% of it, even though we only spent about 2 minutes on it.
Really? Yeah. Did you rehearse it?
A little bit. Well, I told other people about it, which then helped the rehearsing. But I didn't actually rehearse any of the memory palace aside from telling people about this cool thing.
Well, that counts, though.
Yes, it certainly counts. But I think if I engage in more active repetition, I'd forgotten the one about challenges. I did remember the treats. I did think about how people met their partners. I did think about another one, which you just didn't mention, about if you could change how you were raised. Is there something you could change? What would
right.
It be? I remember that one.
Right. So, that's one that I think is pretty useful. I've got one for the things I'm interested in. So, if I want to start a conversation with somebody, I can sometimes, I often ask people, do you like Star Wars or do you have a dog? Those are my 2 first questions. And, the answer to do they like Star Wars is basically 50% yes and no. So that's a pretty good hit rate. Yeah. And dogs are actually pretty good too,
If they say no to both, you're like, I have to go be somewhere else.
Well, see, but this is the thing, is that, actually people rattling off all the things they're interested in is not an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
So I have a memory palace of my childhood best friend's house. And I can remember the things I'm interested in. The things I'm most interested in this world are fantasy fiction, cognitive science, Star Wars, productivity, writing, publishing, and bicycling. And the chance of finding one of those things in common with the person that you're talking to is better than normal, just like fishing around for that kind of thing.
I find this all very interesting because I always felt that I had a pretty good memory, but I've always been so terrible at memorizing things. So obviously, there's just a failure in using proper tricks, and I wonder, do people who are like actors and have to memorize lines and things like that use tricks like this in their profession? Is that likely what's going on?
Not that I know of. My experience with actors is that they are usually trying to deeply understand the structure of the story and their character and their character's desires, and they try to make the lines meaningful in that context.
Okay.
But there are some... I wish I'd known about memory palaces when I was an actor. I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
When I was doing more acting, there were some plays that were very difficult to memorize the dialogue for, and memory palace might have helped. For studying, like for the your medical board exams or whatever, you gotta be you gotta be judicious because there aren't that many places you can actually use as a memory palace. I know I have a list of about 20 places I could use for a memory palace, and about 10 of them are occupied.
Sure.
And I only have about 10 more. And stuff like getting from my house to where I am right now, I couldn't really be a memory palace because I wouldn't be able to identify particular locations very well. Like, okay, wait a minute, was that a location? Are there 3 locations between these 2 locations? It's easier. My usual way with a room is the center of the room, and then I go left to right around the room. So there'll be something in the center of the room, then there'll be something on the dresser, there's something in the windowsill, on the bed, in the closet, and then I go to the next room, right? And that canonical way really helps. Or at a restaurant, it'll be outside the door, in the breezeway, in front of the counter, on the counter, behind the counter, under the drinks. There's another thing I want to mention. Sometimes people say you should remember bizarre things. Bizarre images are easier to remember. Yeah. The science doesn't support that in terms of recall. However, bizarreness does benefit slightly from being less likely to interfere with other memories.
Thanks so much, Jim. It does seem that for those of us who have bad memories, maybe just to put some effort in and to try to hack it and give yourself a memory palace. And now, donating used clothing. Have you ever had some clothing that you no longer wanted or needed, but it was still in decent shape and you wondered what you should do with it? As someone who goes to Value Village from time to time, especially in my youth, where my prize find was a nice 3-piece suit that fit for only $25, nice. I have long wondered about this from the other side, the donating side. But it can be hard to find good data. Happily, Paul J. at CBC recently did an investigative report, and I also use a piece from the BBC by Lucy Rogers. As usual, links available at trcpodcast.com.
Great website.
Many people have more clothes than they need, as evidenced by the fact that they usually don't wear all of it. Not at the same time, except when Joey did that wearing Chandler's.
That's great.
Obviously, there are clothes for special occasions, but I think most of us have a few items that we just don't wear. For those of us emotionally ready to break up with these items of clothing, we usually take them to one of those charity bins. This is the first point of some confusion for some people. Some of the bins are for charity, and some are run by for-profit companies. Consequently, if you care about donating to charity, then do some research on which bin you're putting clothing into.
Fair.
Second, even if you put it in the charity bin, it may not end up in the charitable store, like Goodwill, but be sold to a for-profit corporation, like Value Village. The Canadian Diabetes Association and Big Brothers Big Sisters contract out to Value Village to sort and sell their items. The quote from the CBC article, "Charities including the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, the Salvation Army, and Goodwill collect their own donated goods and sell them at their own thrift shops, but only about half of what they collect makes it onto the shelves and racks, and only half of that will actually sell." Okay, so given that less than 25% is actually resold in Canadian stores, where does it go and what happens? Again, data is hard to come by, but not impossible. Given Adam, Jim, and I live in Ottawa or the surrounding region, it was interesting to learn that a company called Bank & Vogue is one of the biggest Canadian operatives in the world of used clothing. They transfer about 1,000 tons of clothing a week from hundreds of charities, mostly from the United States. The clothes go to reprocessing plants in places such as Toronto, Houston, or India.
Oh.
Yeah, another quote from the CBC article. Some of the clothing may be repurposed as rags for industrial use. Some is ground down and reprocessed for use as insulation or car seat filling. And some is sorted and sold overseas to second-hand retailers in countries such as Kenya, which imported close to $21 million in worn clothing from Canada last year, according to Statistics Canada.
Wow.
End quote.
I think I feel better about my clothes ending up in Kenya than being sold in Ottawa.
You could be sitting them on car seats.
Yeah.
A rough estimate from the CBC piece is that about 20% is resold locally, 25% sold secondhand abroad, 30% cut down for rags, 20% ground down and reprocessed, and 5% is unusable or landfill.
Only 5% is just not used. That's
Of
interesting.
the stuff that's donated.
Yes.
These numbers seem similar to what is stated in the BBC piece, and I quite liked a little insert the BBC had, so I shall quote it. The onward journey of our clothing depends very much on what we have donated. Different garments tend to end up in different places. For example, Andrew Brooks' research found that white dress shirts regularly headed to Pakistan, where there was a great demand among lawyers. Warm coats often traveled to Eastern Europe, and short-sleeve tops and shorts, perhaps predictably, ended up in Africa. For some context, Dr. Andrew Brooks is a lecturer in development geography at King's College London. Now that you have a general understanding of what happens to clothing when you put it in a bin, let's turn to a brief exploration of whether this is good or bad. As Adam said, he might feel better about it going somewhere else. CBC quotes Kate Bayan, Charity Intelligence Canada Managing Director, as saying, "I don't think we should be exporting our garbage to developing countries, and I would put donated clothing in pretty much the same bucket."
Ooh.
She further stated the textile industry of Kenya has been wiped out by our generosity.
Really?
Of course, if it were truly garbage, then it wouldn't be having such a big impact on the industry.
Fair.
That said, Bayan has some support in her stance because 6 countries in East Africa proposed a ban on importing used clothing in 2016.
Wow.
But then, some of these countries changed their mind after pressure from the United States because they had duty-free access to U.S. markets and they didn't want that jeopardized. Welcome to the complicated world of international trade.
Yeah.
You may have been hearing about some tariff issues from time to time.
So the U.S. wants to offload their clothes to another country?
They probably don't want any restriction on what they want to be able to do, correct?
Yeah, I guess.
Yes, there's money.
Yeah.
I mean, in Canada, it's over $150 million.
So
States could
the
be
other
much
country
bigger.
is paying Canada or is paying them for it. Okay.
Now, I can imagine local people are probably of diverse opinions in these so-called secondary markets. As usual, I can see some thinking it's useful to have access to these goods, the opportunity to buy, or even the opportunity to sell them, while others thinking it is hurting the local industry. But the average person's awareness of an industry being hurt isn't evidence that it actually is or not. Just ask almost anyone you've ever met.
Yeah.
Quoting the BBC piece, since the 1980s and 1990s, used clothing has gained a significant market share across Kenya, Malawi, Mozambique, Nigeria, Rwanda, Senegal, Swaziland, Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. In Uganda, second-hand garments now account for 81% of all clothing purchases.
Wow.
This is Andrew Book's research. Additionally, the BBC piece states that, and this is an Andrew Book's quote, points to Ghana as an example of a country where local industries have been particularly negatively affected. Its textile and clothing employment fell by 80% between 1975 and the year 2000. Nigeria's 200,000 person textile workforce has all but disappeared.
It's kind of like, it kind of makes me think of the bigger picture. Is it still good for the people there to get potentially more affordable clothes? And are those industries worth protecting to the point where these are better jobs for the people there, or are these people unemployed and having less revenue, or are they getting jobs in other fields? It's hard to really dissect exactly what that full impact might be.
Given some of these countries, I imagine if they're not having this job, they might not be having any job.
Yeah.
It's not just about secondhand clothing, but cheap textiles from Asia that's coming in.
Yeah.
So the purchaser might actually prefer decent quality secondhand clothing from the United States or Canada compared to cheap products from Asia or even locally produced things, but that may not be good for the local economy. Full textile recycling doesn't really exist yet, and apparently over 80% of secondhand clothing just goes to landfill. This was a different article, which is not what CBC said.
That's not really consistent because they said 5% is tossed in the one.
I know. It's a bit of a mess.
Yeah.
What is to be done? Well, to minimize landfill, impact on foreign markets, and perhaps your own sense of psychological well-being, you should probably just buy fewer items of clothing and wear things you already have.
Yeah.
That said, if people suddenly stop buying lots of junk they don't need, it would negatively impact our economy. But, says Darren, most people won't stop buying junk they don't need, so if you are one of those who might actually stop, probably you should stop, and things will probably be fine.
So, did you say one study said 5% of donated clothes goes to landfills? And another study showed 20?
80.
So the issue there, I think, is that people are just throwing out their clothing. I think that's what
So
it's
one's
to get.
donated and one's all clothing.
I believe that's the reason why.
Yeah,
there's a
people throw away
discrepancy.
clothes all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah, usually I kind of look at it and I say,
Would
can this
anyone-
be worn again?
would a
No,
Kenyan
this
want
one's
this?
tossed and this one I keep, right? And,
Right.
I would never donate underwear or socks. But
Well,
I'll donate,
and this is where there's going to be some collecting advice. So
Yeah.
if you already have more clothing than you need, what should you do?
yeah.
Try giving it away to various community groups that freely exchange items. If that doesn't work, should you keep putting stuff in bins? Well, it is probably better than the garbage can, at least in terms of local impact. Some places suggest ensuring the items are of higher quality, while others say that even if it is ripped or stained, it actually doesn't matter. But if it is wet or moldy, no, just throw that out. I think if we look at something that's ripped or stained, we might think, well, I'm not going to donate this to charity. That's terrible. But then if you think of that being ground down to do some sort of industrial filling of it, doesn't really matter in that sense.
Yeah.
The issue of used clothing donation is messy and complicated, but I hope my overview has provided some value.
Sounds like everyone should donate clothes. To me,
Yes.
it's providing clothing to people who need it, and that's proven by the fact that they're willing to pay for it. And it means that there's less clothing production that has to happen, which is also efficiency.
But what about the impact on developing countries that seem to have their economies affected?
I don't think it's clear their economies are affected, because you just said that it was affecting a particular industry. So if people are choosing to buy those clothes, it's probably good for their economy as a whole. In the same way that even though Walmart closed a lot of stores, right? There's the report that there's an estimate that it saves like poor people thousands of dollars, just the existence of Walmart. So, I mean, I could be wrong about this, but it seems like anytime the consumer level is able to get cheaper stuff, particularly stuff like food and clothing and housing, you shouldn't be trying to prop up some industry. It's always better for the consumer to have a cheaper goods. But
Right, and that's almost the general argument for all international trade. But what's a protected industry? What are tariffs? And I think the phrase prop up an industry is very interesting, because that very much relates to the flow of goods across borders. And as we've seen, propping up an industry can be recast as national security, as is currently done by a president, which some people may or may not agree with. But there is some logic that if you don't have some sort of protection, you may actually just lose your entire manufacturing base, which could harm people.
So you might want to protect it in its nascent stages in order for it to get a foothold. I guess it's a question of, is it, they pick their battles, right? Is it worth do these countries really need a textile industry?
Well, as they said, they wanted to fight back, but they thought it was better to have access to U.S. markets, at least some of the ones in East Africa.
And at the end of the day, someone's level of wealth doesn't necessarily have to do with the number in their bank account, but the purchasing power. So if they have options and they have good clothes coming in, or relatively good or cheaper clothes coming in, that's
I think we need a couple developmental economists here to
Yeah.
sort this out a bit better. And thanks for listening to us once again. Jim gave us a nice overview of mnemonics, memory palaces, and some personal examples. Jim, aside from being a fantastic professor of cognitive science at Carleton University, if people are interested in your stuff or want to see more about what you're up to, where can they find you?
Well, my website is jimdavies.org, and I have a book out called Riveted and a new podcast called Minding the Brain. And you can see that at mindingthebrainpodcast.com or wherever fine podcasts are sold.
Or just download it for free. Cool. And I gave you an overview of used clothing donation, which indicates you probably should donate the clothing if you already have it, but consider just buying less clothing in the first place. Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, cuboids.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.